Hello everybody, welcome to the second class of KK's chess tutoring series. First, let's quickly revise what we learned last class. We learned how to set up the chessboard and how most of the pieces basically move. Let's look at a setup. In white's perspective, the left down corner should be A1 black square, and in black's perspective, the left down corner should be H8 also black square. And when we set up the pieces, we first put 8 pawns before all of the other pieces. Then we put the rook on the corners. Then we put the king and the queen in the middle. And for white, the queen is placed on the white squares, and for black, it is placed on the black squares. Or you can remember that the queen is placed on the D file, or the king is placed on the E file, which one you prefer, it doesn't matter. And next is the bishop and knight over here respectively. Oops. So how does the pieces move? Let's see. For the bishop, it moves diagonals only. For the rook, it moves horizontally and vertically only. For the queen, it is like the sum of the bishop and the rook. It can move diagonally, horizontally, or vertically in any straight lines. And the king is like a midi queen. It can move in all directions, but only in one square. Only in one square at a time. And at last, the pawn. The pawn can advance to one square only at a time, and it captures by moving in the diagonal square one square in front of it. When the pawn is at its original status, you can choose to move 2 squares forward at once, or just move 1 square forward at once. And the pawn cannot capture 2 squares forward over here, like in this direction. When the pawn advances to the opponent's last horizontal line, it can choose to promote or to change into any other piece except itself and the king. It can choose to change into the knight, bishop, rook, or the queen. At last, we have our piece, the knight. The knight moves in a circle or in an L, depending on which way you remember it. And the knight has a special ability, which is to jump over pieces and go to its square. And this class will be focusing on some other special rules. First is the rule of castling. When we see the setup of the board, the kings and the rooks is in these positions respectively. Castling refers to one of these two moves. We can move the king here, which is 2 squares to the rook, and we can swap the rook to the other side. I'll do it again. The king can move to the rook 2 squares, and the rook swaps to the other side. This castle for white is called castling short. The king can also go castle to the other side. The king moves to the rook 2 squares, and the rook swaps to the other side. Let's do it again. The king moves towards the rook 2 squares, and the rook swaps to the other sides. This castle is a special move that can quickly ensure you to connect the rooks and to get your king to safeties, usually in the corner. This I will teach you later when we are in the other sessions. However, castling has some strict rules. First rule is that these 3 squares which the kings go through cannot be under black's attack. For example, if black has a rook over here, it is controlling this square. You simply cannot castle into its attack or its check. Otherwise, the rook will directly capture the king and you lose. The rule also says that you cannot castle when the rook is controlling the square directly right next to your king. In this way, you cannot castle. This is how the rules are set up. Also, when your king is directly under a piece's attack or it is under check, you cannot castle. You cannot do that. Okay, this is the first rule of castling. The second rule of castling is that the castled king and rook must be at its original position. So if the king is over here and the rook is over here, you cannot do castle. The king and rook must be at its original position. Similarly, if the king is at here, although this looks very similarly to castling, but the king is not at its original position, so it cannot castle. However, if one wants to castle to the short side, like this, it does not matter whether where this rook is. For example, this rook is on another place in this board or is simply taken. It does not affect white's castling over here. And the third rule is that when you want to castle, the king and the rook that the castling involves mustn't be moved. For example, if you move a king upward and backward to its original position like this, you go here and you go back, you cannot castle anymore. And if you move this rook somewhere and you move it back, this does not matter. White can just directly castle over here. It doesn't affect white's castling on this side. So these are the rules of castling. Another special move is called En Passant. Yes, the pronunciation is a bit weird. It is a special move between 2 pawns and 2 pawns only. Well, we've taught before, like for example in this position, white's pawn wants to advance to the last line of opponents to promote to a piece. However, black's pawn in the diagonal on the pawn's left side and the right side, any black pawn can control white's way through to the last line. So white cannot promote its pawn easily. Similarly, white also controls black's promoting line. However, we see that in this specific position, when white's pawn is at its original position and black's pawn is over here on the 4th line, white can choose to advance its pawn 2 squares forward and avoid black's capturing. So white pawn can simply promote to the last line. The move en passant is that when the pawn chooses to move 2 squares at once, black can choose to immediately capture white's pawn. Black's pawn directly goes to this square and the white's pawn is taken off the board. I'll show that again. In this position, white directly advances its pawn 2 squares forward and black captures it immediately like that. If black does not capture it immediately in his move, for example, he moves his bishop to somewhere, in the next move, black loses his chance to capture white's pawn. This is the move en passant. Thanks for listening.